Learning Python from Ruby, Differences and Similarities. I know Ruby very well. I believe that I may need to learn Python presently. For those who know both, what concepts are similar between the two, and what are different? I'm looking for a list similar to a primer I wrote for learning Lua for JavaScripters. Simple things like whitespace significance and looping constructs, the name of nil in Python, and what values are considered truthy. Is it idiomatic to use the equivalent of map and each, or are mumble something about list comprehensions mumble the norm? If I get a good variety of answers, I'm happy to aggregate them into a community wiki. Or else you all can fight and crib from each other to try to create the one true comprehensive list. Edit, to be clear, my goal is proper and idiomatic Python. If there is a Python equivalent of inject, but nobody uses it because there is a better/different way to achieve the common functionality of iterating a list and accumulating a result along the way, I want to know how you do things. Perhaps I'll update this question with a list of common goals, how you achieve them in Ruby, and ask what the equivalent is in Python.
My suggestion: don't try to learn the differences. Learn how to approach the problem in Python. Just like there's a Ruby approach to each problem, that works very well given the limitations and strengths of the language, there's a Python approach to the problem. They are both different. To get the best out of each language, you really should learn the language itself, and not just the translation from one to the other. Now, with that said, the difference will help you adapt faster and make one-off modifications to a Python program. And that's fine for a start to get writing. But try to learn from other projects the why behind the architecture and design decisions rather than the how behind the semantics of the language.
Here are some key differences to me. Ruby has blocks, Python does not. Python has functions, Ruby does not. In Python, you can take any function or method and pass it to another function. In Ruby, everything is a method, and methods can't be directly passed. Instead, you have to wrap them in procs to pass them. Ruby and Python both support closures, but in different ways. In Python, you can define a function inside another function. The inner function has read access to variables from the outer function, but not write access. In Ruby, you define closures using blocks. The closures have full read and write access to variables from the outer scope. Python has list comprehensions, which are pretty expressive. For example, if you have a list of numbers, you can write, to get a new list of the squares of all values greater than 15. In Ruby, you'd have to write the following. The Ruby code doesn't feel as compact. It's also not as efficient since it first converts the values array into a shorter intermediate array containing the values greater than 15. Then, it takes the intermediate array and generates a final array containing the squares of the intermediates. The intermediate array is then thrown out. So, Ruby ends up with 3 arrays in memory during the computation. Python only needs the input list and the resulting list. Python also supplies similar map comprehensions. Python supports tuples, Ruby doesn't. In Ruby, you have to use arrays to simulate tuples. Ruby supports switch/case statements, Python does not. Ruby supports only single inheritance. If you need to mimic multiple inheritance, you can define modules and use mixins to pull the module methods into classes. Python supports multiple inheritance rather than module mixins. Python supports only single-line lambda functions. Ruby blocks, which are kind of /sort of lambda functions, can be arbitrarily big. Because of this, Ruby code is typically written in a more functional style than Python code. For example, to loop over a list in Ruby, you typically do. The block works very much like a function being passed to collection.each. If you were to do the same thing in Python, you'd have to define a named inner function and then pass that to the collection.each method, if list supported this method. That doesn't flow very nicely. So, typically the following non-functional approach would be used in Python. Using resources in a safe way is quite different between the two languages. Here, the problem is that you want to allocate some resource, open a file, obtain a database cursor, etc., perform some arbitrary operation on it, and then close it in a safe manner even if an exception occurs. In Ruby, because blocks are so easy to use, see number 9, you would typically code this pattern as a method that takes a block for the arbitrary operation to perform on the resource. In Python, passing in a function for the arbitrary action is a little clunkier since you have to write a named inner function, see number 9. Instead, Python uses a with statement for safe resource handling. See how do I correctly clean up a Python object? For more details.
I know little Ruby, but here are a few bullet points about the things you mentioned. Null, the value indicating lack of a value, would be none. Note that you check for it like x is none or x is not none, not with equals equals or by coercion to boolean, see next point, dot. None, 0th numbers, 0, 0.0, 0j, complex number, and empty collections, set, the empty string, etc. are considered falsy, everything else is considered truthy. For side effects, for loop explicitly. For generating a new bunch of stuff without side effects, use list comprehensions, or their relatives, generator expressions for lazy one-time iterators, ticks/set comprehensions for the set collections, dot. Concerning looping, you have for, which operates on an iterable. No counting, and while, which does what you would expect. The Froma is far more powerful, thanks to the extensive support for iterators. Not only nearly everything that can be an iterator instead of a list is an iterator, at least in Python 3, in Python 2, you have both and the default is a list, sadly. There are numerous tools for working with iterators. Zip iterates any number of iterables in parallel. Enumerate gives you index, item on any iterable, not just on lists, even slicing arbitrary, possibly large or infinite iterables. I found that these make many looping tasks much simpler. Needless to say, they integrate just fine with list comprehensions, generator expressions, etc.
In Ruby, instance variables and methods are completely unrelated, except when you explicitly relate them with @_accessor or something like that. In Python, methods are just a special class of attribute, one that is executable. So for example, that difference has a lot of implications, like for example that referring to f.x refers to the method object, rather than calling it. Also, as you can see, f.x is public by default, whereas in Ruby, instance variables are private by default.
If you want to support the channel, please consider liking and subscribing.